Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition here of Point of View, and boy, do we have a lot that we are going to try to cover in the next couple of hours. First of all, I want to spend some time today getting into the issue of China. That was a topic I was going to address on Monday because of this very good article put out by the head of national security here in the United States. I'm glad in some respects I didn't do it that day because we had so many other things going on. Yesterday I was going to get to it, and then we had so many other topics that it got bumped out, and that is probably good as well, because not only is the first article here about the national security threat of China, but a second one that has now surfaced from Axios, which is hardly, a right-wing group or anything like that, but they have been following the impact of this Chinese spy. And so, first of all, we have an individual in Congress, Democrat, I might add, who is in the House Intelligence Committee, who has had a relationship. He kind of changes the whole idea of being in bed with China because of the relationship he's had with her, and all sorts of other individuals that, as a matter of fact, another article surfaced about an Ohio mayor, and also, it's getting really incredible how this one woman, kind of a Matahari, has been able, as a Chinese agent, to actually gather, apparently, all sorts of intelligence. And so we're going to spend some time talking about China. And then there's a new report that came out from the Senate, and that has to do with some of the connections of the Biden family, which shouldn't be that surprising to any of you, but nevertheless probably would be very surprising to some of the individuals in the mainstream media who have been sheltered from all of those connections. So we really could spend an entire hour just on China. We won't. As a matter of fact, I won't even start there because it will take a while to go through that. But I might just mention that we also have some material we're going to get into in just a minute in terms of the pandemic. One that's called COVID and Censorship. That's by Alex Berenson, who's actually been on the program with us. He wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of things we talk about because he's worked with the New York Times, tends to be really left of center, but I got to love his willingness to pursue research wherever it goes. And he was on the program with us last time talking about, for example, marijuana and the dangers there. This time, of course, has been digging out all sorts of information that is contrary to the so-called received wisdom about how to deal with a pandemic. So we have that. We will probably, if we have some time today, talk about this lawsuit from the Attorney General and the impact that it might have on the election. And one piece that I've posted, and I wish I'd posted it earlier, is a list, and it was created by our friends at World Net Daily, of all the cases charging ballot irregularities or electronic fraud. So this is a very long list for each particular state. And what it does is it lists, various articles that have been surfaced in that regard, or some of the testimony that surfaced in some of the hearings, or some of the allegations. So it's a pretty long and exhaustive list, which I just wanted to be there for you to know it exists. So the next time people say, there's not a shred of evidence of fraud, let's say, well, okay, this list goes on for 6 pages. And each one of those links would, if you print it all out, would probably be a few hundred pages. Now, all of it could be wrong. but it's rather unlikely. And so I just wanted you to have that, and it's one of the articles we've posted there as well. Just as a quick update on what we will be doing next hour, Thaddeus Williams will be with us. We'll be talking about this new book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. He is a professor at Biola and has noticed that most of the questions his students ask have to do with the issue of social justice. And so he felt it's probably time to sit down, take the time to read through all of this. And as an individual that's also on the adjunct faculty of jurisprudence for Trinity Law School, he actually originally studied with Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri. Brings a lot to the table, by the way. Takes us through 12 questions Christians should be asking about this issue of social justice. So we will spend an hour with him. And if that's not good enough, at 2 o'clock, from 2 to 2:30, that's about all we could get from John Stonestreet. We'll talk about one of his Breakpoint articles. Once we've covered that, I suspect we'll probably get into some other issues that he's been writing about as well. And then before it's all through, I might do a reprisal of some of the things we've learned about with China. Just before we take a break, let's spend just a few minutes on the pandemic. And first of all, point out that Alex Berenson points out that since June, Amazon has twice tried to suppress his self-published books. Actually, they're booklets, to be perfectly honest, and they are written about the COVID-19 disease and also the response to it. And he actually, in many cases, says that, look, he is convinced that after he's taken the time as an investigative reporter, remember when people used to do that kind of investigative reporting? Well, he has concluded that some of the things being proposed to control the coronavirus are, he says, damaging, counterproductive, or unsupported. And so the company actually pulled for a while some of his and refused to publicize them. The company also, of course, Google owns YouTube, and it is disclosed that it has pulled more than 200,000 videos about the epidemic, including one from Dr. Scott Atlas, who's a physician, was on the coronavirus task force, but it doesn't matter. I don't care if you're the president. I don't care if you're a doctor. I don't care if you're on the task force. We're pulling you. And then he also points out how Facebook has not only censored videos, but attached labels and fact checks to all the rest. And then even points out that you have this one incredible study done by these Danish authors, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, in which they really said it's questionable how effective some of these masks really are, the way they're being used today. And they had difficulty actually getting a journal to publish it. And even when they did, the journal's editor felt compelled to write a whole piece just defending her decision to publish it in the first place. And so he said that he would like to actually take these booklets and turn them into a book. And he has yet to find a publisher. And so he ends his column by saying this. He sort of laments. He says, I might have to turn to a conservative publisher if that's what it takes to be true to liberal principles. Isn't that amazing? He's a liberal. And by the way, I might just point out that we got some friends, that's like Jay Richards and others, that did get their book dealing with COVID-19 published by Regnery. So if he's looking for a publisher, I got a suggestion. You might want to go there. Real quickly, while we're talking about the vaccine, William Shakespeare got his inoculation yesterday. Did you see that? The man named William Shakespeare, first man in the UK to get it. 90-year-old woman actually beat him, but it's okay. The two of them got it. We have noticed now 2 individuals did get an allergic reaction, which, makes sense. I mean, lots of times before they give you an injection, they ask, are you allergic to other medicines? Are you allergic to food or medicines or things of that nature? So there have been 2 people that have. But again, I don't see that as terribly negative. I think that's pretty much standard fare. So nevertheless, just thought I would post that in case anybody says, well, and there have been 2 that had anaphylactic reactions. Yes, that happens. To food, to peanuts, to shellfish, and to vaccines. So that is still pretty much steady as she goes, and we'll learn a little bit more each day as this vaccine is being implemented in the UK. Tomorrow, Food and Drug Administration is supposed to actually give their approval, and next week some people might get a shot in the arm, figuratively and literally. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This year of 2020 has been full of chaos. Therefore, it's not surprising that Victor Davis Hanson wrote about the time of chaos upon chaos atop chaos. He wasn't even talking about the chaos of the pandemic and lockdowns. He focused merely on the political chaos we have endured for months. He is more optimistic about our future than most of us might be. He opens with this statement: America will weather its current hysterias. I'm not so sure. The political landscape has given us the Steele dossier, charges of Russian collusion, and impeachment of a sitting president, weaponization of FISA courts and the FBI, CIA, and the Justice Department. And all of that happened before the election and the current claims and counterclaims about election interference. He also talks about the media that poorly prepared the nation for their envisioned Biden presidency. To foster that agenda, journalists have done enormous damage to this country. He also notes that Joe Biden was never fully vetted. Rather, he was protected and sheltered by the media. We will now see whether he is cognitively up to impromptu press conferences, 18-hour days, tough negotiations with opportunistic foreign leaders, and the demands of transversing the country to rally both the country and his party adherents. I might also add that since he was never fully vetted, even people who voted for him aren't exactly sure of what will be his agenda next year. Many are already expressing surprise at some of his proposed cabinet picks. How will he deal with China? Will he try to ban fracking and embrace the Green New Deal? We really don't have good answers to such questions because the media failed to do its job in this last election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, we're going to spend some time talking about China. The first article here is China a national security threat? Yes. Matter of fact, the actual title, which was written by John Ratcliffe. You might say, okay, who is he? Why should I pay attention to him? He is the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. Before that, he was a member of Congress in the 4th Congressional District. For many of you, you've heard Van Taylor on. He's the 5th Congressional District. You've heard Louis Gohmert. He was in the 1st Congressional District. Of course, you know all these different individuals that we've interviewed over the years, and his response is rather dramatic. I could just read the first paragraph, and that's really all you need to know, but we'll get into the details. He says, as the Director of National Intelligence, I'm entrusted with access to more intelligence than any member of the U.S. government other than the President. I oversee the intelligence agencies, and my office produces the President's daily brief detailing the threats facing the country. If I could communicate one thing to the American people from this unique vantage point, it is that the People's Republic of China poses the greatest threat to America today and the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide since World War II. That's a pretty strong statement from the Director of National Intelligence, who sees more intelligence than you and I can even imagine. It is an incredible job, and it requires probably a great deal of distance mentally and emotionally from some of the circumstances that you are confronted with every day.
But then he now takes you through step by step. And I'm going to take you through this because there's a good reason why we think this is important. Number one, I also agree that China is the greatest threat to America. Number two, I recognize that you will not hear this probably anywhere except in maybe some of the conservative talk shows, and maybe not even all of them. Number three, there are going to be, and already are, people saying China is not a threat at all. The other day, I make him anonymous, but one of the people working at MSNBC said China is not our enemy. Just blatantly said that. And yet, and of course, you've had a number of reactions if anybody says that China is an enemy or points out the human rights abuses of China. Again, do I have to refresh your memory about the NBA? In just a few minutes, we're going to talk about the connection of Chinese spies with some Democrats in Congress, with other members of various political groups and all of the rest. And so John Ratliff does this, if for no other reason, because he recognizes that this is something that the American people need to know about. So his second paragraph said, the intelligence is clear. Beijing intends to dominate the U.S. and the rest of the planet economically, militarily, and technologically. Many of China's major public initiatives and prominent companies offer only a layer of camouflage to the activities of the Chinese Communist Party. He says, I call its approach of economic espionage rob, replicate, and replace. China robs companies of their intellectual property, replicates the technology, then replaces the U.S. firms in the global marketplace. He gives some examples, and I'll just give you the summaries of it, but I would encourage you to read it. For example, one of those is where the Chinese company actually stole trade secrets from American superconductor. Even though they actually imposed penalties on China, the theft resulted in that company losing more than $1 billion in shareholder value, and ultimately had to cut 700 jobs. And, of course, that just illustrates, again, the way in which that's been taking place with intellectual property for some time. But it isn't just with companies. Maybe you remember the other day when at the Harvard University Chemistry Department, the head of it was arrested because he was selling secrets to the Chinese. And they were paying him $50,000 a month because he was selling these secrets, which, again, oftentimes are part of companies, part of government, part of the academy. And so as a result, that was the case. And so, again, they were trying to also attract other top scientists and reward them for stealing information. Okay, let's take another one. I'm looking across the window to someone who goes to the MD Anderson Cancer Clinic in Houston, and 3 scientists last year from the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston were actually removed because of their theft of cancer research. And the U.S. government ultimately estimates that the theft of intellectual property, I've just given you a few examples, but I've tried to give you different kinds of examples, one in medicine, one in semiconductors, one in chemistry, and all those kind of illustrate the point that the loss of intellectual property cost America $500 billion a year, or as he said, about $4,000 to $6,000 per U.S. household. Now, there's another aspect. China also steals sensitive U.S. defense technology in order to fuel China's attempt to become the foremost military power. U.S. intelligence, he says, shows that China has even conducted human testing on members of the People's Liberation Army in hopes of developing soldiers with biologically enhanced capabilities. This is kind of Brave New World kind of stuff, 1984, just unbelievable. There are no ethical boundaries to Beijing's pursuit of power. He does not say it here, but let me say it. You know how large the army is in China? Not just a few, not just a lot. 1 billion. 1 billion. Isn't that amazing? I mean, again, you because you can actually pull together so many individuals. But the standing army,
was it 100 million, something like that? I mean, it's just unbelievable the kind of army capability that China has, and it's pretty incredible. So again, I said 1 billion, 1 million plus, again, the possibility of putting together an army of 100 million. I kind of misspoke there, but nevertheless, go on to the next point, and that is the whole issue of what is called emerging technologies. Now, that gets you into the 5G telecommunications flap, which you probably heard about before, and he goes into how that could collect intelligence, disrupt communications. He even says threaten user privacy worldwide, and just a variety of other things. And so, again, you can see what China can put on the table in terms of military, in terms of trade secrets. And he says, okay, here's another way in which China is having an influence even in our own government. He says this. Consider this scenario. A Chinese-owned manufacturing facility in the U.S. employs several thousand Americans. One day, the plant's union leader is approached by a representative of the Chinese firm. This businessman explains that the local congresswoman is taking a hard line on legislation that runs counter to the interest of China and Beijing, even though it has nothing to do with the industry the company is involved in, and says the union leader must urge her to shift positions or the plant and all its jobs will soon be gone. So the union leader contacts his congresswoman, indicates that his members won't support her re-election without a change in position. He tells himself he's protecting his members, but in that moment he's doing the bidding of the Chinese government. And the congresswoman is being influenced by China, whether she realizes it or not. So he takes you through all sorts of scenarios here. And if nothing else, near the end, since we're coming to the end of our segment here, John Ratcliffe goes on to explain that we shouldn't assume that Beijing's efforts to drag the world back into the dark will fail because the forces of good have triumphed before in modern times. He says China believes that a global order without it at the top is a historical aberration. It aims to change that and reverse the spread of liberty around the world. Beijing is preparing for an open-ended period of confrontation with the United States. Washington should also be prepared. Leaders must work across partisan divides to understand the threat, speak openly about it, and take action to address it. He says this is our once-in-a-generation challenge. Americans have risen to the moment. I've always risen to the moment. After defeating the scourge of fascism to bring down the Iron Curtain, this generation will be judged by its response to China's effort to reshape the world in its own image and replace China as a dominant superpower. The intelligence is clear. Our response must be as well. So again, this is the first article we've posted by John Ratcliffe, who again is the Director of National Intelligence, who, as he points out, sees more intelligence information than anyone else in this country other than the President of the United States. So when we come back, I might have stopped there 2 days ago, but now we have these blockbuster stories coming out about a Chinese spy that has been able to infiltrate everything from members of Congress to mayors. And then we now also have the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committee providing this incredibly alarming report about the connections not just of Hunter Biden to China, but also some really deep connections of James Biden, who's the brother of Joe Biden, to the Chinese Communist Party. So we'll go through all of that as well. China on the docket at the moment, and if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, Hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Let's continue looking now at the issue of China, and that takes us to our second article, and this comes from Axios, which, by the way, I actually have two articles. I've posted the one that we're going to focus our time and attention on, and there's some others. Let me also, as an apology to any of our Asian listeners out there, Chinese is not my first language, obviously, and so if I mess up one of these names as we especially go through the Senate report, you hopefully will be gracious enough to forgive me for not necessarily knowing how to do so. But this Axios report, it's our second article here, and again, we post these because we'd like you to read them. Don't trust me. Don't even necessarily trust the head of national security and national intelligence, although I think we should. And, of course, Axios has been able to document this with the various intelligence agencies, so I think this is on pretty firm foundations as well. And this one, I'll just read part of the article. A suspected Chinese intelligence operative developed extensive ties with local and national politicians, including a U.S. congressman. And that congressman, by the way, is Representative Eric Swalwell, Democrat from California, also is a presidential candidate and sits on the House Intelligence Committee, has access to a lot of intelligence that you and I would never have access to. So just remember that as well. But not just him. We're going to talk about a mayor in Ohio where they actually have electronic surveillance of the sexual encounters in the car. Nevertheless, let's go on. And they believe that this political intelligence operation run by Chinese main civilian spy agency took place between 2011 and 2015. This has been a year-long investigation by Axios. Why it matters? Well, first of all, it offers a rare window, they say, in how Beijing, that is China, has tried to gain access to and influence in political circles. Remember, just a minute ago with the material from John Ratcliffe, I talked about how they had access to medical research, intelligence research, how they were able to rip off various companies, replace them, and put them out of business. But this one is dealing with political individuals. And the significance of this story in light is also a video, which maybe we can post in the next day or two, which has subtitles. So you'd have to watch it and then read the subtitles, in which you have a Chinese a leader basically bragging that they have now connections. China now has very strong connections in every aspect of American society, in the media, in politics, all different forms of the government, the executive branch, and all the rest. Which brings me back to a point I'm going to make. You need to have some discernment. When you hear somebody on air, especially, or a politician say that China is not an enemy, you probably have to assume that they're being influenced by them, maybe even getting paid by them, because you cannot look at all the things China has been doing over the last even few months, not to mention over this last year. And we're not just talking about the virus. We're talking about the military rattling and all the rest. China has the largest navy in the world. I was looking up just to make sure, actually there's about 2.8 million soldiers, sailors, and others that are in the Chinese army right now, standing army, more than 1 million, of course, that are military, but they are convinced that they could raise 100 million if they had to by putting all sorts of individuals that have served in the past back into uniform. And it's amazing the amount of push that China now has and the technological advantage they're trying to gain. But let's go back to the political piece, because the second section here says that the woman at the center of this operation is a Chinese national. Her name is Fang, although she went in this country by Christine Fang, and she targeted up-and-coming local politicians in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, but also across the country, because I'll be talking about one in Ohio. And through campaign fundraising, extensive networking, personal charisma, romantic and sexual relations, with a couple of mayors as well, not to mention the member of Congress. Although Swalwell, to be fair, his office said when asked about whether or not he engaged sexually with her, they said, well, that was classified. Okay, I think we know the answer for that one. But nevertheless, we'll leave it there. And Fang was able to gain proximity to political power and all of the rest. Now, some people might say, well, some of these are kind of lesser knowns. I mean, when she first started working with Eric Swalwell, I think he was a prosecutor, wasn't he, at the time, but then became a member of Congress. But the argument that they're making is that these individuals in the Chinese Communist Party, they have the long view in mind. And, for example, they said the case demonstrates China's strategy of cultivating relationships that may take years or even decades to bear fruit. The Chinese Communist Party knows that today's mayors and city council members are tomorrow's governors and members of Congress. And boy, that turned out to be the case. Well, nevertheless, of course, let's connect it to the member of Congress, Eric Swalwell. She took part in all sorts of fundraising activities for his 2014 re-election campaign. His office was actually staffed by at least one individual that she placed in the office as an intern. And so then eventually federal investigators began to be so concerned about her behavior with him that they actually then did indeed tell Congressman Swalwell that this was an individual that they had been watching because she was a Chinese foreign agent or spy, whatever word you want to use. So the statement from Swalwell's office is, Representative Swalwell long ago provided information about this person who he met more than 8 years ago, whom he hasn't seen in nearly 6 years. We'll see. Okay. To protect information that might be classified, we will not participate in your story. So that's as far as we can go with that particular story. But it's the second article, and you can read it. Before we take a break, couple more. There is a new one that has just come out here. An Ohio mayor hooked up with a Chinese spy in the back of a car. How do we know that? Well, it turns out that at that time, the FBI was conducting electronic surveillance on Christine Fang. So apparently, we've got pictures, video, all sorts of things about this Ohio mayor in the back seat with a woman, and that story has now just come out in the last 24 hours as well. And a couple more real quickly. One of the things that's so striking is the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committee has been doing some investigation on the relationship between Hunter Biden and China and Ukraine. And so they came and actually have said that they have seen some very significant involvement of the Biden family in foreign business ventures. They then point out that Hunter Biden and Devon Archer spent some time working with various individuals, including Gongwen Dong and Yi Jiamin, who is his associate. They executed various transactions for these companies, which are all, if you will, shell companies for the communist Chinese government. And more importantly, I just mentioned a minute ago, Yi Jiamin, he is financially connected to the vice president's brother, James Biden. And thus they conclude, I'm just reading now, there exists a vast web of corporate connections and financial transactions between and among the Biden family and Chinese nationals. Hunter Biden has extensive connections to Chinese businesses and Chinese foreign nationals that are linked to the communist government. Those contacts bore financial fruit when his father was vice president and when he left office. And so that's the latest report that's come out of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. It's the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committee. And they take you through the various companies. That would be China Energy. It would be the China Energy Fund Committee. And a lot of these are simply tied to Communist China. That report, again, is documented. So is the Axios report. But there's one more I thought I'd mention before the break, and this one isn't as well documented, but if it's true, it really raises some eyebrows, because according to the filings with the Security and Exchange Commission, that's the SEC, it reveals that the communist Chinese government actually purchased Dominion voting systems 1 month before the November 3rd election. Now, one of the individuals looking at this said, if true, so again, when put if true, a report that the communist Chinese government bought Dominion voting is beyond stunning. It appears that the Chinese government purchased one of the key electronic voting system companies through a New York subsidiary of UBS Bank. The subsidiary has multiple board members with deep ties to the Chinese government. The implications of this revelation, which were first brought to light by attorney Lynn Wood, who we've talked about on this program, are almost difficult to fathom, as it calls into question everything we think we know about the integrity of our elections. As one person put it, China didn't hack our elections. They purchased the machines that processed our elections. That one's still being investigated, but if indeed that filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission illustrates once again why we need to pay attention to China, and anybody tells you that China is not our enemy either has not looked at the facts or is simply turning a deliberate blind eye to the obvious. Let's take a break. We'll get into some other topics on our list of topics right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention again that in the next hour, we're going to be talking about this book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. Dr. Thaddeus Williams will be with us, and it really looks at questions that all of us as Christians should really be asking about this issue of social justice. So we'll get into that. And we'll also have John Stonestreet with us in the next hour. But I thought real quickly, we're seeing some movement for the first time now on the idea of another aid package for coronavirus. coronavirus. And Byron York, who is an individual that I quote from time to time, said one of the most appalling moments in recent history of the House of Representatives occurred Friday at the Capitol Visitor Center, where Speaker Nancy Pelosi gave her weekly news conference and said she had changed her position on the issue of passing a coronavirus relief bill. So he says, well, what happened? Well, a new president had been elected, Pelosi noted, and the coronavirus vaccines are nearing public distribution. He says, well, that's just a total game changer, a new president, a vaccine, and this kind of short-term relief that she blocked for months is now acceptable. And so Byron York says, as a policy, it made no sense. Why condition help for struggling Americans on the development of a vaccine? Didn't the lack of a vaccine in the last several months with a virus raging and no end in sight make it even more urgent to help people? Well, I think we know the answer to that. Yet Pelosi wouldn't do it, and she refused to even have any kind of meaningful dialogue with President Trump, as you may well know. So Byron York says really what this is the short version is that Nancy Pelosi suffered from what he says a case of toxic Trump derangement syndrome. Remember, this is the Speaker of the House who made a show of tearing up a copy of the State of the Union speech in front of the joint session of Congress while the president stood a few feet away and millions watched on television. This is the Speaker who called the COVID-19 and a worldwide pandemic the Trump virus. But nevertheless, this was one of the things that Byron York points out, because this is the same Nancy Pelosi who stonewalled, he said, virus relief efforts in an election year when a relief bill would have helped millions, but might also have the secondary effect of helping Donald Trump. She simply would not even consider it. And in case you think Byron York is off target, he then quotes from some others, like the New York Times. Pelosi is playing hardball on coronavirus relief. She thinks she'll win, in a New York Times headline. So again, that is the case. And the Times went on to say, emboldened by Republican divisions and favorable political landscape, the Speaker is refusing to agree to a narrow relief measure. And it wasn't that she was just against the Republicans. She was even against a lot of the Democrats, because there is this group called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And there are a number of Democrats in that caucus. There are some Republicans. Van Taylor's been on this program as one of those members, in which they were trying to come up with at least an alternative of $1.5 trillion bill, but she dismissed all of that and told her hand-picked chairs to dump the plan. Later, when she was even asked, was it a mistake not to accept half a loaf, she just yelled out at people, if you might remember that part of the press conference. So here you have, I think, very good evidence of the fact that the only reason she was really against spending at least some money during the crisis was because it might have helped the re-election campaign of Donald Trump. And, of course, if that's news to you, you haven't heard some of the other things we've talked about, how now there's very good evidence that indeed the press did a very poor job of covering the pandemic, because any positive news might in one way or another help the president. So whereas most other news organizations around the world were about 50-50 positive, negative, our press, mainstream press, was 90-10, more than that was 92%, 92-8 really, in terms of its negativity, as illustrated by that as well. Well, where do we go with this Texas lawsuit? Well, I've posted this piece by Julie Kelly. We may get into it later in the week, and she takes us through what indeed the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is trying to do in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I may come back to it later when we're actually broadcasting to people in some of those states and what this might mean to the Supreme Court. I don't think it goes anywhere. I never really thought that it did. But I'm giving up trying to make predictions in this year of 2020, because so many things have changed dramatically that it's really hard to predict what might happen. But nevertheless, that particular case is still being considered, and it's what is called original appellate jurisdiction rather than appellate jurisdiction. And so it goes straight to the Supreme Court. We'll see where it goes. Just before we take a break and we spend some time talking about this very important issue of social justice, I thought I might remind us that taxes have an impact. I guess it was the finance minister for Louis XIV that once said that the art of taxation consists of so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest possible amount of feathers with the smallest possible amount of hissing. But I would argue that a lot of liberal politicians don't know the line between plucking the golden goose and killing the golden goose. And I think you have seen some examples first in Seattle and now just this last week in San Francisco. About 2 years ago, I think I talked on this program about how there were a lot of liberals that were sleepless in Seattle. There's not a lot of rest for progressives up there. They're trying to find different ways to extract gold from the golden goose. And so the city council back then actually approved what was called a head tax on companies that made over $20 million a year. So we are going to, in a sense, come up with this wealth tax, if you will. And it's really not hard to guess what has happened since then, because a number of the companies, Amazon, Boeing, and a number of other businesses in and around Seattle started saying, okay, we'll probably still keep our headquarters here, but we're going to actually now start building other places that maybe have lower tax venues. And so that's certainly the case. And so now we have the most recent example, not in Seattle, but in San Francisco, because the political leaders in San Francisco want to pass what's called a wealth tax, and it's aimed at corporate executives. Now, the actual term is called the overpaid executive tax. And, you know, if nothing else, you got to give them credit for being honest about what they're doing. The tax is aimed at companies that pay their CEO more than 100 times the median pay of their workforce. In other words, of course, they feel they should be the ones that determine what you should pay top executives. Now, we've had this conversation before. We may sometimes not like the extravagant pay of corporate executives. Maybe we can use a level of shame or even point to some of those situations, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to justify greater taxes. And by the way, it doesn't work very well, because I posted commentaries in the past where our friends up in Vermont, Ben and Jerry's, everybody like the Ben and Jerry's ice cream, they tried to implement this where they would make sure that the next CEO would not make just a whole lot more than some of the workforce, and it just did not work, because people are not going to leave New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston to go up to a small town in Vermont to be a CEO, so it just simply didn't work. But nevertheless, that's what they're doing right now in San Francisco. And so my argument is, if their goal was to make a moral statement, well, then perhaps they succeeded. But if their goal was to raise more taxes, I have news for them. Those companies are going to start saying, you know, maybe we need to move out of San Francisco, and they are perhaps going to hasten the departure of some of those individuals, because after all, when you try to take too much gold or even feathers out of the golden goose, it screams a little bit too much and it walks away. And that's exactly what's going to happen, I fear, in San Francisco. But that's their decision, certainly not ours here in the state of Texas. And aren't you grateful we don't have people trying to implement these kinds of bizarre taxes on major corporations? Anyway, let's take a break. We have a lot to talk about in the next 2 hours, and we will do so right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
In this program, we've spent some time talking about this idea of social justice and really a difference between a biblical view of biblical justice and social justice. We've talked about all sorts of ideas of race theory and white privilege and a number of others. We had different guests and different commentaries and all of the rest. And so we thought this hour would be really good to try to cover all of that in a book that is just now coming out that really helps you begin to think through some of these really important issues. The book is entitled Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. 12 Questions Christians Should Ask About Social Justice. It is a book endorsed by many people that have been on this program, like John Perkins and J.P. Moreland, Lisa Childers, Tim Challis, Natasha Crane, and a variety, David Dockery, and a couple of other individuals, George Yancey and Trevin Wax, that are actually individuals we've interviewed on this program. So we want to spend some time kind of looking at this in a broader perspective, trying to answer some of the questions that maybe you are asking, and certainly some of the questions that the students were asking of Dr. Thaddeus Williams. He is the author, and he is an individual that teaches at Biola University and also serves as the associate professor of systematic theology at Talbot School of Theology. Also is taught at Saddleback College, at the International School of Human Rights, Labrie Fellowship, the Blackstone Legal Fellowship, and a number of others. So, Dr. Thaddeus Williams, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, talk about the origin of this book. I've watched one of your lectures in which you pointed out that you were sort of drug kicking and screaming into this a little bit, because what you found is that it's not a pleasant topic, as you've pointed out before, to research all of this, but you found yourself, as I have, when you speak in a classroom, having lots of questions surfacing about this idea of social justice. And it isn't just those kids that are maybe secular-minded or liberal. I think even across the spectrum, whether they're Christian or secular, whether they're liberal or conservative, are just trying to think through this whole idea of social justice, since it has really been thrust upon us, especially this year.
Sure. I mean, I've been in the classroom for ages, but in the last 5 years, is where I've noticed a really dramatic shift, where students used to question an idea if they thought, well, is there evidence? Is it biblical? Those were the driving questions for a long time. And now ideas are less questioned because of their merit and more based on their melanin. Who's saying it? Is it a white person saying it? Is it a male saying it? There's this fundamental epistemological shift. Why do I believe what I believe? And I found this cropping up all over the place, where, it used to be teaching apologetics and theology and philosophy from a Christian perspective. The problem of evil was the number one question, but that's significantly shifted in the last couple of years to how do we think about social justice and all the landmines buried in that word combo. Like, how do we think about racism and sexuality and gender? And so that was a huge motive to write the book. Was I looked out and there weren't a a ton of resources for Christians who are trying to navigate these times biblically.
Again, the book is published by Zondervan. We have information about it. It's just about ready to come out, and so you can get a copy or at least order it and have it delivered. There are 12 sections because we're looking at 12 questions and 12 chapters broken into 4 parts, and so we're going to kind of take each one of those parts as best as we can. And that first one are the questions about social justice and worship, Jehovah or Jezebel. And I thought maybe I would jump into one on the issue of the Imago Dei. Does our vision of social justice acknowledge the image of God in everyone, regardless of size, shade, sex, or status? And, I've run into this quite a bit, Dr. Williams, because, you have these debates. Do Black Lives Matter? Do Blue Lives Matter? Do All Lives Matter? But if you start from a secular mindset, which says we're just a product of evolution and there is no right or wrong, there is no ultimate authority, then why do any lives matter? So really, in some respects, with that particular question, you're taking us back to kind of first principles, aren't you?
Exactly. I mean, think of it this way. If the universe is a closed box, it's autonomous, there's no God outside the box who made the box, the lid of the universe isn't open so God can reach in and bestow meaning and dignity and purpose on our lives, then we're all just kind of clumsily bumping around inside the universe. And when you do that, you start to judge other people on purely inside the box categories. And the problem is, if you leave God out of the equation and we're all inside the box and we start judging each other totally on the basis of what's your skin tone, do you have a XY chromosome or an XX chromosome? What's your economic status? All of these categories. And when you start there from inside the box categories, you inevitably end up with some kind of us versus them tribalism. Versus starting in a biblical worldview, you start with a God outside the box who creates the universe and creates every human being from every tongue, tribe, and nation. We are all image bearers without exception. Whether you're black, white, or anything else, whether you're male, female, whether you are big or smaller than a peanut, you have intrinsic worth, value, and dignity because you bear the image of God. If we don't start there, then whatever we're calling justice isn't biblical justice.
Let's, if we can, take a break. When we come back, we'll get in more detail. Going to talk about racism and sexuality and socialism, culture war, abortion, tribalism, critical race theory, identity politics, to mention just a few. Each one of these chapters has a section which at the end tells a story of an individual. Sometimes it even has a thought experiment. And then it has a questions for personal or small group study. So as we're going through this, I recognize that some of you may just want to read through the book on your own, but I also know that we have a good number of you that are pastors or Sunday school teachers or small group leaders. You might say, this is something I would really like to take my college group through, maybe the adults through, maybe some of the kids in our Sunday school class through. And so there are some great resources here that look at these 12 very important questions that we need to be able to ask and answer about social justice. So we'll come back and focus on a couple of other aspects. 12 questions, 12 chapters broken into 4 parts, and we'll try to cover each one of those sections. And then just an enormous number of appendices that you will find helpful as well, so that if you really want to try to think through these issues and maybe articulate them in a way that would be responsibly, you will not only benefit from the appendices, but also just an extreme number of endnotes and extensive notes that are there as well. So the book entitled Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, forward by John Perkins and written by Dr. Thaddeus Williams. We'll come back right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The This year of 2020 has been full of chaos. Therefore, it's not surprising that Victor Davis Hanson wrote about the time of chaos upon chaos atop chaos. He wasn't even talking about the chaos of the pandemic and lockdowns. He focused merely on the political chaos we have endured for months. He is more optimistic about our future than most of us might be. He opens with this statement: America will weather its current hysterias. I'm not so sure. The political landscape has given us the Steele dossier, charges of Russian collusion, and impeachment of a sitting president, weaponization of FISA courts and the FBI, CIA, and the Justice Department. And all of that happened before the election and the current claims and counterclaims about election interference. He also talks about the media that poorly prepared the nation for their envisioned Biden presidency. To foster that agenda, journalists have done enormous damage to this country. He also notes that Joe Biden was never fully vetted. Rather, he was protected and sheltered by the media. We will now see whether he is cognitively up to impromptu press conferences, 18-hour days, tough negotiations with opportunistic foreign leaders, and the demands of transversing the country to rally both the country and his party adherents. I might also add that since he was never fully vetted, even people who voted for him aren't exactly sure of what will be his agenda next year. Many are already expressing surprise at some of his proposed cabinet picks. How will he deal with China? Will he try to ban fracking and embrace the Green New Deal? We really don't have good answers to such questions because the media failed to do its job in this last election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
New book by Thaddeus Williams, and again, it is entitled Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, published by Zondervan. 12 questions Christians should ask about social justice. And Dr. Williams, let's, if we can, talk about one of the more vexing questions, and that has to do with idolatry. Idols on the left, idols on the right, idols of self, idols of the state, idols of social acceptance. Some of it has to do with the fact that individuals might think that they're looking at this with some level of objectivity, but we always have to check and make sure we haven't made an idol out of something, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of the list you just gave, I'd say one of the most important for thinking biblically in 2020 is making sure that we aren't bowing to the idol of social acceptance. I see far too many brothers and sisters who are shaping their answers to big questions. What is marriage? What is gender? How do we think about race? And so forth. Not starting with what does God have to say about this, but what's not going to incur the wrath of the online mobs. That seems to be a huge trend. I want to be liked. I want to be considered relevant. I want to be considered on the, quote, right side of history. And so we need to be careful as we're thinking through these massive questions that we're taking our cues from Scripture and not from the society.
Well, and it isn't just that I want to be liked. It is I don't want my life destroyed, because one of the individuals we've had on this program, and I've done a number of commentaries about it, is a book by Rod Dreher called Live Not by Lies, in which he is arguing, and he's really not saying anything we haven't already known. Erwin Lutzer was on talking about his book that also talks about this, and that is that we aren't necessarily facing what Rod Dreher calls the hard totalitarianism of communist Russia or even Nazi Germany, but we're facing kind of a soft totalitarianism that says, okay, you can stray off the liberal progressive plantation and we will destroy you. We will end your job. We will hound you. We will use cancel culture. So in some respects, it isn't just what it was in the past. Well, I just want to be liked and I don't want anybody to hurt my feelings. There are some pretty significant consequences that come when you articulate a biblical worldview, given the fact that some of our friends on the left, and I put friends in quotes, are really coming after individuals that are Christians when they take a stance that is not something they might agree with.
Well, it's important to see that what we're dealing with here, it's typically framed as you got those far right-wing Christians, and they're going toe-to-toe with the secularists and the culture wars. And it's important to think biblically about this. So think of Romans 1. Paul says basically everybody's a theist of some kind. Everybody's a worshiper. Everybody bows down to something or someone. So his distinction isn't between, say, the Christians and the secularists. Paul's distinction, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is between creator worship and creation worship.
Yes.
And I think those are incredibly helpful categories for thinking through the headline issues of our day. When you see a lot of what today is called social justice, that's really just a banner that's slapped over creation worship. It says, I, the autonomous self, I get to define myself. I define the meaning of my own biology. I get to define it. And in biblical categories, that's straight up creation worship. And so what we're up against here, and the reason it's so often aggressive and vitriolic and we will cancel you and destroy your career, is we need to be clear about the fact that we are up against a secular theocracy, an attempt to instill creation worship as a required dogma of Western culture. It's not just Christians versus secularists. It's really a question of creation versus creator worship.
Well said. Well, you've been talking about the individual. Let's talk about the collective for just a minute. That gets us into group identity, tribalism. We've had Jonathan Haidt on this program talking about the coddling of the American mind. This tribalism is not just where it used to be that you and I may disagree and you have a different viewpoint. We disagree and you're not just wrong, but you're evil. And so one of the questions you ask is, does our vision of social justice take any group identity more serious? And you're talking about the difference between being in Adam and in Christ. Explain that if you might.
Sure. So based on a lot of ideological visions of social justice today, the idea is, depending on where you stand on a pyramid or a hierarchy of oppressed versus oppressor, that determines whether you're guilty or blameless. That determines whether you're credible or should be written off. And so we break people into these intersectional tribes. And what that does, we aren't only dealing with idolatry, that is a false god. We're dealing now with a false gospel. Gospel answering the question, how do I get justified? How do I be declared righteous? And now, under a lot of the trendy ideologies, I can be declared righteous not by my in Christ identity, but by my in this or that oppressed group identity. And we just need to be crystal clear on that. That is a false gospel. In a biblical worldview, everybody from every tongue, tribe, and nation is united in a scandalous group identity of being in Adam. We are fallen. And that, in a strange way, that's a foundation for unity, because now I can't think of myself as more righteous or holy than my neighbor because of my skin tone or social status or gender or anything. We are united by our all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God identity. But then comes the in Christ identity that draws together every tongue, tribe, and nation. And I got to tell you, that's what the world's looking for. How do you have unity? But apart from the in Christ identity, it's a pipe dream. Recognizing our shared fallenness in Adam and that our only redemption comes in Christ, there you have a rock-solid foundation for true unity.
Again, a great vision for social justice. Let me pick out one more, and that is what you call the fruit question. Does our vision of social justice replace love, peace, and patience with suspicion, division, and rage? And I've said before that when I see some people really just railing against whatever it might be a biblical idea, it might be a political idea, whatever, my question is, are you trying to build a bridge? Are you trying to convince me? Or are you just trying to ridicule me? Are you just trying to sow more seeds of division? Or do you really want to bring about a resolution? And so that's why you call that kind of the fruit question.
Exactly. And honestly, that's one of my primary motives for writing the book, was seeing dear friends and seeing students who started getting wrapped up in what in the book I call social justice B. There's social justice A, the kind that's compatible with the biblical worldview, and social justice B, the kind that's incompatible. I saw more and more friends getting wrapped up in social justice B, and I just saw the joy in their life and the love and the peace and the patience and kindness just slowly but surely get replaced with suspicion and rage and self-righteousness and always assuming the worst of everybody else's motives. And so there's a few stories in the book from some of my co-authors where they talk about how liberating it was to rediscover the gospel and how that produced the Spirit's fruit in their life after they had been stuck in this mindset that encouraged people to be offended, that encouraged people to make snap judgments about each other. And so that's just one more way I think biblical justice offers us a far brighter future than the stuff we're reading about on our news feeds every day.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll focus on parts 3 and 4. Of course, there's 6 chapters, and we've sort of just tapped into about 4 of them, so we won't cover all the 12, but nevertheless, I think you're going to find those really helpful. And at the epilogue, there is 7 differences between social justice A and social justice B. There's 7 different appendices, endnotes, a lot of great resources, 260 pages, and it's just coming out, and I think it is certainly something that you could study by yourself, but I'm very impressed at the fact that there is a story at the end of each one of the chapters of an individual, and then a series of questions for personal or small group study. So this may be something you may seriously want to consider as a way to maybe address this issue that is surfacing in your small group or your Sunday school class or maybe even in your church. So again, we are privileged to have with us today Dr. Thaddeus Williams, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with him as we talk about the book Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. We'll be right back.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Confronting injustice without compromising truth. And we're continuing our conversation today with Dr. Thaddeus Williams. 12 questions Christians should ask about social justice. And Dr. Williams, before we go on, I've been promoting your book, and nothing better than having somebody promote your book on a national radio program, but I think you probably can do so as well. And I've suggested that for many of our listeners who may be pastors or Sunday school teachers or small group leaders, they may want to use this because you have a whole section there on questions for personal and small group study. Sometimes you have a prayer. You almost always have a story of an individual, and sometimes some other implications as well as some appendices. So this is really kind of intended not only for personal study, but also could be really used as a group study, couldn't it?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I have the honor of speaking at many churches all around the country and sometimes around the world. And this issue, I was just talking with a pastor on the East Coast last Friday, and the question of social justice is tearing his congregation down the middle. It's ripping it to shreds. And so I wrote this with an eye towards the local church. There's pastors all around the country, all around the world. How do I think biblically about this? How do I navigate these, thorny conversations? How do I get the congregation starting first with Scripture instead of, the narratives we're handed today in our political landscape? How do we think biblically about all this? So, yeah, I definitely wrote it so it easily adapts to small group studies, to personal studies for pastors to be able to inform their sermons. Yeah, this was written with an eye towards the local church.
Let's, if we can, look at a few more questions. One is the disparity question. I wanted to camp out on that one because, first of all, it's something I've done a number of commentaries on. Our most recent issue of Outlook actually has significant quotes from Walter Williams, who just died recently, as well as Shelby Steele, and a variety of other individuals that are actually addressing that. And oftentimes there is an assumption among social justice warriors that if there is a disparity, it means discrimination. And you call that a good example of social justice B. In other words, some examples you use there are the number of women that work in Silicon Valley. Is that because that a lower percentage because they are discriminating against women? No, I don't think so. But because that percentage is different, that is the case. You can take the number of African American men that are in prison, or whatever number that you want to look at. You can look at income. You can look at a variety of others. And the sad reality is, as you talk about here, is that if you are going to instead prefer damning stories or damning statistics to undamning facts, you're going to fit into that category that you call social justice B.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not merely an assumption of social justice B that any disparity automatically is best explained by some vicious form of discrimination. It's not just an assumption, it's a doctrine. It's orthodoxy in social justice B circles, to the extent that if you even question it, you are automatically branded a sexist, a phobic, a bigot, a hater, a racist. And this is something the church we need to be discerning about. I give one example in the book of the fact that, home loans, if you look at the statistics, white people tend to be approved twice as often as black people for home loans, which if you just isolate a statistic like that, you jump to the conclusion, well, that's systemic racism, that's discrimination, that's just proof of America, that racism is in the DNA of this country, as Obama said it. Well, the problem is if you zoom out a little bit and take all the evidence into account, white Americans are denied twice as often as Asian Americans for the same home loan. And so are we going to say that there's systemic anti-white oppression in this country, given the 2-to-1 ratio between Asian American and white American home loan approvals? Or look at the income disparities between conservative Protestants in this country compared to other people groups, whether we're talking about Indian immigrants, whether we're talking about Jewish Americans. There are massive disparities, and nobody's out there waving banners for the anti-conservative Protestant system that's stacked against us.
Yeah, and on some of those income disparities, I probably have had more negative comments about things I've written about that because, again, the median family income for Asian Americans is much above it is for white Americans and all the way down, and much higher for Hispanic Americans as for African Americans. And, again, nobody's arguing that there is a discrimination against whites or Hispanics over Asians. But, again, those games get played, and sometimes I like to take it out of economics. Go ahead.
Let me just real quickly say this, that if America is white supremacist to its core, we aren't very good at it because white Americans list 17th according to statistics from the government when it comes to household income, with other people groups beyond the white demographic outperforming economically. So if the entire country, as we're told by Social Justice B, is rigged to pit whites against the other ethnicities and put them on top, then we're pretty lousy at being white supremacists.
Sure. And one of the things I've used before, Thomas Sowell, when he wrote his last column, because I guess he was writing columns all the way up to age 90, he wrote one about football and fallacies, because he was saying that one time when they had an African-American, a black punter, come on the field, everybody goes, fake, because he says, like, I've seen hundreds of black players score touchdowns. I've seen a black president, but I've never seen a black kicker in the NFL. But you know what? You do. So some of these issues are just illustrated about how we have been conditioned to assume that when we see a disparity, it implies discrimination. But what about
the real concern there? I'm sorry to interject again, but part of the concern there is, Scripture commands us to do justice, but the minute we redefine justice along social justice B lines so that we read any disparity as discrimination, now all of a sudden we're fighting a boogeyman of the real problem. And so a lot of people, I guarantee you, if they were listening in on our conversation, they would just think, that's just straight up white supremacy. That's all that is. They don't care about the plight of the oppressed. They don't care about racism. And quite the opposite is true. We care about fighting real racism, and so that we shouldn't be led off on rabbit trails or follow red herrings, trying to find racism under every rock. If you're going to fight the real thing, we need to fight the real thing and have clear definitions so that our justice pursuits aren't diluted in all directions all at once.
And that's one of the arguments I make against fake hate crimes, is that every time we have a fake hate crime, then it causes people to sort of roll their eyes and then be less focused on a real hate crime that might be there. When you have so many people crying racist when it isn't racist, then when you do come to a real racist issue, you've conditioned people to just go, yeah, I've heard that before, instead of taking it seriously. So there's a lot at stake here that I don't think people really understand. But while we're talking about race, one of your chapters, of course, is the color question. Does the vision of social justice promote racial strife? Or, of course, what we try to talk about on this program, racial reconciliation. And that's an important question, too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. From the beginning of the Bible, God has a vision through Abraham to bless all nations. All the way to the end of the Bible, every tongue, tribe, and nation bowing down and worshiping the Lamb. God has a multi-ethnic kingdom vision, and he always has. And so if we allow some of the social justice B categories to creep into Christian conversations, it's like planting C4 at the foundations of the church, because racism gets fundamentally redefined by social justice B. And the minute those redefinitions, almost like a Trojan horse, are welcomed into the Christian citadel, it's really hard to have any semblance of real Christian unity.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and when we come back, we'll focus maybe on one more. There are so many good questions in this book, so many good chapters, but I thought we might talk about one that, again, may not occur to you, and that's what's called the suffering question. Does our vision of social justice turn the lived experience of hurting people into more pain? Because the argument usually is that we need to listen, and of course I start one of my commentaries about, let's listen to some of these voices. And then I start talking about some of the voices that oftentimes are not heard. But what does this maybe actually do in terms of this idea of social justice? So we'll talk about that one. And also, once again, just help you understand how you can turn this book into a great study that you can do either personally or as a group. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Thaddeus Williams as we talk about 12 questions Christians should ask about social justice. Book is entitled Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, published by Zondervan. And Dr. Williams, let's see if we can talk about the suffering question. And I'll start maybe in the positive sense. We should listen, no doubt about that. The Bible commands us to be quick to hear. We should bear one another's burdens. We should weep with those who weep. So we have a real responsibility ability to listen to any plight that an individual has. But when you keep repeating the lived experience, maybe you can take us into brain research for just a minute, and even confirmation bias, and I tell you that maybe this is a racist society and you're a victim of racism, then you go into a grocery store, you go into a restaurant, and somebody's rude to you, and you say, well, that's just racism. Instead of recognizing they would have been rude to you or me or anybody else, whether you're black, white, male, female, whatever. And so in some respects, it just confirms something that may not necessarily be true. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here in terms of the vision of social justice that can sometimes turn the so-called lived experience into actually creating more pain for individuals.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kirby. And you started exactly where we should, biblically, which Scripture doesn't suggest. It commands that we weep with those who weep and grieve with those who grieve. It's hard to do that if you just plug your ears to people's experiences. And so, yes, listen, but biblical listening is very different than what social justice B means by listening. In social justice B, that means the experience of anybody who has a subjective sense of oppression has to be taken authoritatively. And to question it, you're automatically on the wrong side of history. And let's think about the effects of that. Give you an example in the book, that if somebody has a traumatizing experience with spider when they're a kid, let's say they develop arachnophobia, what would be really helpful to that person would be, in terms of the brain chemistry, it's some neuroscientists call it the center. It ignites, it lights up like a Christmas tree. They see a daddy long legs, and based on their old traumatizing experience, they're afraid for their lives. So a bad therapist would say, well, that spider terrified you as a kid. If there's a daddy long legs under your bed, then beware, because all these spiders are out to get you. But what is happening there is the brain's fear center, the center, lights up like Times Square. Meanwhile, the assessment center of the brain, the part that helps to reason with ourselves, to preach with ourselves. You see this all over Scripture when the psalmist will say, why so downcast, O my soul? His assessment center is lighting up, and he's saying, I feel like despair is the logical conclusion of how I feel right now. But his assessment center lights up, and he's saying, but wait, God is God. God is sovereign. God has never failed me in the past. Look at his faithfulness to me. Look at his faithfulness to Israel. And so a good psychiatrist or a good psychologist or therapist or counselor is going to help light up people's assessment centers to question their emotional interpretation of their experience. And that can be done through, hey, here's a picture of a spider. How do you feel? Let's talk you through that. Here's a spider in a terrarium. Let's talk you through how you feel about being in the same room with a spider. And eventually, the patient can hold and pet, a tarantula without being terrified, because they've learned to ungeneralize their personal trauma. And I argue in the book that social justice B does the exact opposite. It generalizes people's trauma. You had this experience, well, everything's racist all the time. You had this experience, so everything's sexist all the time. You had this experience, so there's bigots and phobics and haters all around you. And this isn't just academic for me. I've seen the effect personally that kind of thinking has on friends. And it's devastating. It's the opposite of a biblical worldview that commands us to fear not.
And again, one of the things that we hear most often with our young adults, and it's not necessarily true for everyone, but there is certainly a trend, and we have a millennial roundtable, and I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Haidt, one of the untruths is always trust your emotions. So if you perceive the world through emotions in the first place, and if your brain centers are lighting up every time you have some kind of fear or fear reflex, which you call the center, This isn't easily changed, and I think it explains why we see these YouTube videos where these people are just beside themselves. They are unbelievably panicked. They have an inability to really cope with society, and that comes from years and years of training that has happened on the college campuses, but it happened long before that. It's happened in social media. It's happened with their peer groups. It's easy to look at it and roll your eyes, but it's really traumatic when you realize that how it pretty much makes an individual incapable of living a whole life in this world. And as you said, we have to have compassion for individuals that simply have that kind of overreaction to something that may not be justified. And I've had people come on this program saying, the police are out to kill all of us. And I'm going, where does that word, where does that even phrase come from? But it comes from this idea of that fear reflex. Well, we're just simply almost out of time, and I wanted one more time for you to just mention how we can use that book. You have 7 appendices, a huge endnote section, and then each one of the chapters has a story, and these are really powerful stories, and then some questions for personal or small group studies. So just as we wind down today, Dr. Williams, how can various listeners use this book in an effective way?
Yeah, so let me be frank. A lot of people are going to look at the book and see my name and maybe find a picture of me and say, well, he doesn't get it. And part of the power of this book is you have brothers and sisters from very diverse backgrounds, from different tongues, tribes, and nations, ranging as far as Nepal. One of my best friends, Suresh Buddhapriti, shares his story of what it was like living under the caste system and being an untouchable, and how the gospel helped set him free from that. There's just a lot of powerful stories. There's an ex-neo-Nazi, an ex-white supremacist who found himself fueled by hate and rage and resentment, and the gospel set him free. You just have a wide range of stories that can hit a wide audience, so that it's not just, oh, well, here we go, the same old white conservative perspective. No, these are brothers and sisters who share one thing in common. We look to God as our authority. We look to the scriptures first and foremost, not to the dominant political narratives of our day. And I just don't know of anything else out there on the market right now that's doing that, starting with scripture. And so, again, it's written in a way where, as you said, there's mountains upon mountains of endnotes. Like we did our homework for this book, but it's written in a way that a 16-year-old could pick it up and not want to put it down. So it's extremely accessible to bless your churches. So that's my prayer, is that it would change the conversation in this country, where it's very us versus them and tribalistic and assume the worst of everybody else's motives. And I see that coming from both sides these days.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've listened to Point of View and you link the time, you know what great respect I have for John Stonestreet, individual I've known for a number of years, who now currently is the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. You hear his daily commentary, Breakpoint, as well as a number of other podcasts and other resources that he makes available through the Colson Center. An individual that served on the faculty at Bryan College, a co-author of a variety of books, a book, A Practical Guide to Culture, Restoring All Things, Making Sense of Your Worldview, and so much more. Holds degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and Bryan College, and joins us now by phone. So, John, always great to have you on the program.
Hey, thanks, Kerby. It's good to hear your voice, my friend.
Well, I thought for just a minute I would go back to something you wrote last month and did a commentary on. It's called A Fancy Dinner Isn't a Moral Failure. Now, it really has nothing to do with dinner, but it has everything to do with, here I'm holding up our booklet on capitalism and socialism. We also have a book coming out this month on socialism. This earlier one kind of looked at the issue of capitalism and socialism and some of the criticisms of capitalism. The new one deals with some of the arguments for socialism. But the point that you were making back then about a fancy dinner was actually that there were people that were complaining about an individual who, because he was quite a celebrity cook and interviewed by NPR, was charging a lot for a meal. Now, since then, we found out that I think it was the governor of California, the mayor of San Francisco, were eating rather pricey meals at the French Laundry in Napa. Nobody seemed to complain about the dollars there. But I thought it was a good point, because you weren't really necessarily saying that you, me, or anybody else is going to spend $850 for a dinner, but that this is sort of getting us back into this idea that, well, you can't spend money, they can't charge a certain amount, and that's kind of almost the aesthetic argument that is used oftentimes by people that are criticizing a free market. And even though you and I wouldn't spend that money, there isn't necessarily anything wrong with a celebrity cook putting together some kind of meal. But tell us a little bit more about why you did the commentary.
Well, Kerby, I wouldn't judge you if you took your wife out for an $850, dinner. I don't think your salary would justify that any more than mine. I mean, there's a lot of reasons.
Yes.
There is a lot of reasons we make these personal decisions, and that it would be personally unwise and maybe even a moral failure to spend that much for a meal. If eating that takes food from our family, it's an unwise decision. It was used with money that was acquired immorally. I mean, there's lots of reasons one would choose not to do this, and I can't imagine a situation where I would ever spend that much money for a plate. But that's not what the argument was, and it's increasingly kind of what you might call the icky argument, or again, you called it the aesthetic argument, which I think is a really good one. Is that the chef at this restaurant, Thomas Keller, was being interviewed about a cookbook, and what the guy doing the interview, from NPR, basically said it was not fair that some could afford it and some couldn't. In other words, the argument against Keller's restaurant was the fact that the Kardashians could eat there, but that the other people could not. Which is somehow this argument that says if it's available at all, it has to be available to each and every person. It's this idea of the equality of outcome as opposed to the equality of opportunity. And that's really the fundamental difference between a socialist view of the world and a market view of the world. A market view of the world understands that, we should have at some level an equal opportunity to get ahead, to use our gifts and our abilities. This is where the rule of law comes from. To use the old analogy, teach a man, give a man a fish or teach a man a fish. We want to make sure in a just society that people have access to the pond, and if they catch it, they can keep it, things like that. But the mentality behind the questioner at NPR was different. It was, we should all have the same amount of fish. We should all be able to cook it the same way and eat it the same way. It's not an equality of opportunity. It's an equality of outcome. But that fails to take into consideration the years of effort and energy that Thomas Keller put into his craft. It fails to take into account the business acumen that he had to start this business and to build it. The amount of people that he employs, the amount of tax dollars that he puts into the system, which we know, since it's in California, is a good bit. This is the fundamental difference. And so often when people critique success in our culture, it comes from this, icky argument or this aesthetic argument that I just don't like that some people have more than others. But that fails to take into account the realities we know of talent, of giftedness, of opportunity, of influence, of marketing, of all kinds of things. And all of these rising tides end up lifting all the ships, right? In other words, yes. The fact that we can even have a conversation says a lot about the success of the market system and the opportunities that it ends up bringing to people.
Well, and one of the other aspects of that is the fact that you have a younger generation that has sort of bought into that argument. Before you were on, we did an interview with Dr. Thaddeus Williams. He's got this new book coming out, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, 12 Questions Christians Should Ask About Social Justice. By the way, this is a perfect book to review also on Breakpoint. But it's just a good illustration of what he's run into as a professor at Biola and at Talbot, in that more and more of these students are asking questions about social justice but not thinking about it biblically, which of course brings us back to why I'm such a great fan of Breakpoint, because people aren't really thinking through that issue. And sometimes you need to say, well, what is fair? The example I used the other day when I was speaking to a bunch of students was, okay, LeBron James makes about $37 million a year, and a social worker starting out makes about $30,000 a year. Now, is that fair? Well, they didn't want to say that because they kind of like LeBron James, or I do this for my liberals. Jeff Bezos makes $320 million a day, $320 million a day, while the average Amazon salary is $35,000 a year. All of a sudden, it kind of puts it into a different kind of category, but these are the kinds of things that we need to talk about, and one of the reasons why, of course, I know you and I have always been great supporters of Summit Ministries and Worldview Academy and Mind Games Camp, and anything we can do to train young people. But I thought when we come back from the break, we might see if you have some other comments about this. But then today you're talking about on Breakpoint, is Christmas a pagan holiday? And the whole Jesus is myth is certainly one I thought we might address. And most importantly, one of the reasons why I have John Stonestreet on is that if you aren't getting the Breakpoint commentary delivered into your inbox, we have a way where you can click on his button and it will take you to breakpoint.org. It's an organization that I have such respect for, and the commentaries are so well done. And so you can not only find his commentaries, but all sorts of other podcasts and other great resources. So I just wanted to feature him for a minute. And especially during this Christmas season, how do we think about some of these important issues like Christmas or even capitalism? We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This This year of 2020 has been full of chaos. Therefore, it's not surprising that Victor Davis Hanson wrote about the time of chaos upon chaos atop chaos. He wasn't even talking about the chaos of the pandemic and lockdowns. He focused merely on the political chaos we have endured for months. He is more optimistic about our future than most of us might be. He opens with this statement: America will weather its current hysterias. I'm not so sure. The political landscape has given us the Steele dossier, charges of Russian collusion, and impeachment of a sitting president, weaponization of FISA courts and the FBI, CIA, and the Justice Department. And all of that happened before the election and the current claims and counterclaims about election interference. He also talks about the media that poorly prepared the nation for their envisioned Biden presidency. To foster that agenda, journalists have done enormous damage to this country. He also notes that Joe Biden was never fully vetted. Rather, he was protected and sheltered by the media. We will now see whether he is cognitively up to impromptu press conferences, 18-hour days, tough negotiations with opportunistic foreign leaders, and the demands of traversing the country to rally both the country and his party adherents. I might also add that since he was never fully vetted, even people who voted for him aren't exactly sure of what will be his agenda next year. Many are already expressing surprise at some of his proposed cabinet picks. How will he deal with China? Will he try to ban fracking and embrace the Green New Deal? We really don't have good answers to such questions because the media failed to do its job in this last election. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, continue our conversation with John Stonestreet of Breakpoint. And again, this particular commentary came back in November. It was A Fancy Dinner Isn't a Moral Failure. And one of the things I appreciate, John, about the fact is that you not only go through the commentary, but provide, I think in this case, about 5 different resources. One of those is Arthur Brooks, who's been on the program with us. I think we first met him when he was at Syracuse, then at American Enterprise Institute. Now he's moving on as a professor at Harvard. But one of the things I appreciate is his defense of a free market, but also just in your particular commentary, reminding us that the free market has raised so many people out of extreme poverty. And if it weren't for this pandemic and lockdown, we really would be getting to the point where we might completely have eradicated extreme poverty from the world. So when you're looking for the good of capitalism, which is sometimes ignored by some of the people promoting socialism in this country, they fail to recognize how much the free market has done as a positive impact around the world.
That's right. I mean, I think the reputation, and it goes to, movies like, Wall Street back in the day, and other kind of characters like the grumpy banker on It's a Wonderful Life or something like that, is that capitalism is an instrument of greed, right? It is what it's what you endorse if you care about the rich. But what I think Arthur Brooks has done as good of a job as anybody, and I can also point to our friends at the Acton Institute and other places,
yes,
is helping us understand that, look, if you care about the poor, you should be an advocate of a market system. Because, and by the way, as a Christian, and what we try to do at the Colson Center, and I certainly appreciate your kind words and always consider, Kerby, you to be a co-laborer in so many different ways. But when we get to the Christian worldview side of this, it's not just because it works, although it does. I mean, we've seen the market lift people out of abject poverty. We've seen the rate of abject poverty around the world cut in more than half. And by abject poverty, I mean starvation level poverty. Just in the last 30 years has been cut in more than half, where, as you said, people could see the end of it from here. We haven't reached the end of it yet, but you can see it from here. Just on that pragmatic level, we should be advocates of a market system, one that provides for opportunity. But from a Christian worldview perspective, here's the difference. Christians believe that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, that we're different than the animals in a number of ways. One of those is not just that we are consumers of the created order, but we are actually innovators. We're co-creators with God. God created Adam and Eve and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, essentially giving them the task to take the world that was given to them in creation and develop it, to make it flourish, to make it teem with life and diversity and beauty. And that's what I think a socialist system misses, is it sees human beings as nothing more than consumers. So too many human beings means too many consumers. A famine or something like that means all the resources are gone. But what we see time and time again over human history is that when humans have the freedom and the opportunity to innovate, they bring something else to the set of resources. It's not just the seeds. It's not just the trees. It's not just the crops. It's not just, this fixed pie of a food supply. Humans actually bring in their innovation and their imagination. And suddenly there's brand new sources of value. And those brand new sources of value create wealth. And that's what is that rising tide that lifts all ships. And we also see this, and this is other great work that Arthur Brooks has done, as you know, Kerby, is that this not only solves the baseline problem of do humans have enough to eat, it also contributes to the sense that humans have meaning and purpose.
Yes.
And you talk about the deaths from despair that we've seen across culture over the last couple of years, where people feel like their work doesn't matter, where people feel like they, no matter what they do, they're kind of hitting that ceiling over and over and over. What we understand is when people are not just objects of our pity, but they are subjects in their own story. This is a biblical view of what it means to be human, and we also see that it brings a level of purpose and meaning to their lives that you don't get if you're just a cog in an economic machine.
Well said. Let's, if we can, talk about some of the great resources. Of course, I love Breakpoint. Andrea Bocelli the other day, the beautiful testimony of life. Of course, the one today is Christmas, a pagan holiday. I understand that you have like an Advent ebook. And of course, I'm always trying to promote the various Colson Center conferences. So I've got a couple minutes. Let's just see if we can encourage people to find a number of different resources that will help them during the Christmas season. First of all, of course, you have that Advent book. And of course, even today, writing about Christmas. What do we need to know about that?
Well, you often hear from pagans, like Bill Maher and religionists, who made the claim, all the Christmas celebrations are just, basically Christian hijacks of pagan culture. In which, by the way, he got the details almost all wrong on that. But you even hear Christians say things like, well, I'm not sure if I should celebrate Christmas because it's a pagan holiday. And not understanding two fundamental truths. Number one is that Christians believe that all truth and all good things come from above, right? Isn't that what the scripture says? Every good and perfect gift comes from above. So the birth of Christ and the joy and the beauty and the celebration, these are good gifts that God gives us. And because we believe that Christianity, this is the second point, is not just what's true for Christians, but what's true about life in the world, we should expect sometimes pagans to stumble against the truth, right? This is that wonderful phrase from Al Walters, all truth is God's truth. So we will find this. And what we have seen through history, I'm thinking in particular of the Irish, the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization,
right?
And the wonderful gift of St. Patrick going into this Celtic pagan culture and Christianizing it. He's doing what St. Augustine called spoiling the Egyptians. This is the ability of Christians to take what's good in the world, even if it's uncovered by pagan culture and claiming it for Christ. Because if it's true, and if it's good, and if it's beautiful, where did it come from? It came from Christ. And that worldview gives us an awful lot of freedom, if you ask me. And that's one of the things we wanted to address in today's commentary about is Christmas a pagan holiday. And by the way, it goes along with a video that we have, and you asked about resources.
That's right.
About a year ago, we started this video series called What Would You Say? And our goal is to equip Christians and Christian worldview to have the important conversations. And so all the videos are like, well, you're in a conversation and someone says, oh, science has disproven God. Or you're in a conversation and someone says, women should have the right to choose. You're in a conversation and someone says, gender is a social construct. What would you say? And so today's video that just released, and it's getting a lot of attention. It's a lot of fun. And it's Christmas themed. It's got Christmas decorations to it. It's a lot of fun. But it's that you're in a conversation and someone says, Christmas is a pagan holiday. What would you say?
What would you say?
And in 6 minutes, it walks you through very simple ways to answer that question and to have a really good conversation, whether you're talking with your cynical, skeptical friend or you're talking with a family member who's a believer but is uncomfortable, with the pagan trappings of trees and lights and that sort of stuff. Gives you a way to have a conversation with them.
Might also mention that you have a link there to the podcast with Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I met him, I guess, not decades ago when I actually was able to preach in his church up in Connecticut, and have been following him all these years and have used his book and interviewed him. And, of course, I've known him almost as long as I've known you, or maybe I've known you both about the same amount of time. So just some great resources that are there. But just before we wind down, again, it's all at breakpoint.org. Their podcast. I love What Would You Say? Of course, also the Breakpoint commentaries, and of course you have a conference that you had in 2020, 2021 coming up, so there are all sorts of things. So most importantly, I just think the action item, which we've made available for all of our listeners, they can just go to pointofview.net and click on your picture, or they can go directly to breakpoint.org, either way, and then sign up to get some of the information, because it is going to be very helpful, and it is always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Hey, Kerby, I'm so grateful for you, and I'm jealous, by the way, that you got to preach at Glenn Sunshine's church. It's one of the oldest churches in America.
That's
right. And I've been there, I've visited there, I've taught there, but I haven't preached in that elevated pulpit where I think the pastor, preached a sermon and led the militia out to fight the British. I mean, the history there is just unbelievable.
Unbelievable history.
So
yes. And by the way, that's the third church. The other church was burned down by the Indians. So there's just all sorts of history there in Connecticut. So
unbelievable history. Yeah, it's just really beautiful. But Kerby, so grateful for you. Merry Christmas to you and all your Point of View listeners. And thanks for the encouragement today and pointing people to Breakpoint.
Yeah. Merry Christmas to you and Sarah. And it's always great to have you on the program. I look forward to the next opportunity. But let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to talk about, is China a national security threat? Of course it is. And I'm going to give you some justification for that and some of the facts that you need to know as we talk about that. We'll also give you an update on what's happening with the election. A lot to cover in this last half hour. We will do so right after this.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. It's program note. Let me just mention tomorrow we have Dale Sellers with us for just a little bit, and we'll have Jim Dennison with us during this hour tomorrow. Friday, of course, is Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and I'm looking forward to that conversation. Kelly has had a chance to be in the White House. He's also been at some other events and sometimes has some inside knowledge that he can share with us, and so we'll spend some time talking with him and really kind of evaluating all that has transpired over the last couple of days and weeks. Let's, if we can, get to some of the articles I've posted. The first two are on China. I'm sort of, in some respects, glad that I didn't get to talk about China the other day, because this national security threat article that has been out really since the 3rd of December now is supplemented by a piece that came out by Axios on suspected Chinese spy targeting California politicians. And for our listeners out there in California, one of those that's been targeted was Eric Swalwell, a representative from California, Democrat, who also ran for the presidency, and so that is the case. But not to leave out some of our listeners in other parts, there is another piece here. Mayor of a town in Ohio hooked up with a Chinese spy in the back of a car. I won't get into the details there. This is a family program, but you can figure that out. And then also information that has just now come out from the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committees, really looking at a very extensive report of the relationship between Hunter Biden and China, also Ukraine, and also the incredible amount of involvement of Joe Biden's brother James Biden with the communists in China. So we'll get into some of those issues, but let me just mention real quickly, might not have chance to get to the other articles we posted. One is called COVID and Censorship. That is by Alex Berenson, which he points out that it's been very difficult for him to actually even get his self-published booklets promoted by Amazon. He talks about others that have had difficulty even getting some of their articles posted, and how almost, was it 200,000 different YouTube videos have been pulled that in one way or another challenged a little bit of the, if you will, orthodoxy that is being promoted right now in terms of dealing with the pandemic. By the way, some of that is changing dramatically as well. And then finally, an article that I wanted you to see, and that is, it's called The List, Cases Charging Ballot Irregularities and Electronic Fraud. Very extensive list, goes on for pages, put together by our friends at WorldNet Daily, just so at least you can see some of the various charges, some of the various lawsuits, and a variety of other things, just to try to keep track of some of that is taking place. But I do want to spend some time talking about China for one very good reason. It is, without a doubt, the greatest national security threat, but don't take my word for it. John Ratcliffe is the Director of National Intelligence. Before that, he represented the 4th Congressional District in the state of Texas. And he begins his article by saying this: as Director of National Intelligence, I'm entrusted with access to more intelligence than any member of the U.S. government other than the President. I oversee the intelligence agencies, and my office produces the President's daily brief detailing the threats facing this country. If I could communicate one thing to the American people from this unique vantage point, it is that the People's Republic of China poses the greatest threat to America today and the greatest threat to democracy and freedom worldwide since World War II. Well, I could end right there, because that's the point I'm making. And we're running into and finding more individuals saying, matter of fact, the other day, one of the hosts of MSNBC said, China's not an enemy. Yes, it is. And when you start hearing people say that and denying the threat that China has posed, not only to this country, but to countries in the Asian perimeter and the Pacific region, you have to either say they're not looking at it, or they're maybe just actually co-opted by the Chinese or getting paid or something, because there's no way a reasonable person would not come to the conclusion that the Chinese Communist government is looking to do, as he says next, actually intends to dominate the United States and the rest of the planet economically, militarily, and technologically. This goes on for 3 pages, so I'm going to summarize it quickly to first of all point out that he gives some examples of how they are using economic espionage, what they call rob, replicate, and replace. He gives an example of American Semiconductor, where they actually stole trade secrets and actually then were able to produce all of that. And as a result, the company lost $1 billion in shareholder value and cut 700 jobs. And just a good example of that. He talks about something which was in the news, so this is one place where the press has covered it, just barely, but it has, in which the head of Harvard University's chemistry department was arrested. China was allegedly paying him $50,000 a month as a part of a plan to attract top scientists and reward them for stealing information. That's at a university. Let's take another one. MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. 3 scientists were removed there over concerns about China's theft of cancer research. And the best estimate that John Ratcliffe provides is that China's intellectual property theft has cost America about $500 billion a year, or about $4,000 to $6,000 per household. Then we get into the technology area, because China also steals sensitive U.S. defense technology in order to fuel its aggressive plan to make China the world's foremost military power. It has even actually used human testing on members of the People's Liberation Army in hopes of developing soldiers with biologically enhanced capabilities. As John Ratcliffe says, there's no ethical boundaries to Beijing's pursuit of power. By the way, if you are not paying attention, there are 1 million people in the army in China, and actually 2.8 million overall, because some of those are sailors. Matter of fact, the largest navy in the world, not the United States, it's China. And, of course, all the threatening there. That brings us to another issue, the emerging technologies. And that, of course, gets us into 5G telecommunications and all the issues there, which we've covered before. So I'll skip that to make one other point before we take a break. And that is, he actually shows how, in some cases, the Chinese have been manipulating politics. And that's different than the second article, which we're going to get to in just a minute, of a Chinese spy. Here's how it works, he says. A Chinese-owned manufacturing facility in the United States employs several thousand Americans. One day, the plant's union leader is approached by a representative of the Chinese firm. The businessman explains that the local congresswoman is taking a hardline position on legislation that runs counter to China's, the Communist Chinese, interest, even though it has nothing to do with the industry that the company's involved with, and says that the union leader must urge her to shift positions or the plant and all the jobs will soon be gone. Well, the union leader contacts his congresswoman and indicates that his members won't support her re-election without a change in position. He tells himself he's protecting his members, but at that moment he's actually doing the bidding of the Communist Chinese Party. And the congresswoman is being influenced by China, whether she realizes it or not. So John Ratcliffe begins to then talk about the fact that we shouldn't assume that Beijing's efforts to drag the world back into the dark will fail because the forces of good will triumph as they have in the past, because China believes that a global order without China at the top is a historical aberration and aims to change that and reverse the spread of liberty around the world. China and Beijing is preparing for an open-ended confrontation with the United States, and he says Washington should be prepared. Leaders must work across partisan divides to understand the threat, speak out about it openly, and take action to address it. The sad reality is that it is very clear, especially from this incredible series of reports that came from the Senate Finance Committee and the Senate House Security Committee, that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and James Biden and the Biden family are connected to these Chinese nationals, and that itself should be of great concern. So when we come back, we'll talk about that. And, of course, the most jarring piece that came from the Securities and Exchange Commission, if indeed these filings are correct, it shows that the Communist Chinese government actually purchased the Dominion voting systems 1 month before the November 3rd election. As one wag put it, he said, you know, the Chinese didn't hack our elections. They purchased the machines that processed our elections. And if this is true, then that means that the Communist Chinese government actually was much more involved in the voting than any of us would have ever imagined. Now, that one still needs to be checked out. When we come back, we will talk about these stories that came from Axios about this Chinese spy whose name is Fang Fang, although in America her name was Christine Fang, who was involved in sexual relationships with a member of Congress, some mayors, and a variety of other individuals, and apparently extracted all sorts of intelligence secrets. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, we actually have more articles than we have time to cover, but let's do what we can. The second article I've posted here is by Axios, which, by the way, is done a year-long investigation. Nobody can accuse it of being a right-wing conspiracy group or anything like that, and yet they have found that a Chinese intelligence operative actually developed extensive ties with local and national politicians politicians, including a U.S. congressman. And I might mention there's another article that's come out here of hooking up with a mayor in Ohio. And it turns out in this case, nobody can deny that because the FBI was engaging in electronic surveillance of the two in a sexual encounter in the mayor's car. In the back seat, I won't even get into that. This is a family-oriented program, but it's pretty salacious as well. And it turns out that this was part of a political intelligence operation run by China's main civilian spy agency, and this is part of the investigation of Axios. The woman at the center of this, her name is Fang Fang, or actually was known in America as Christine Fang. She targeted up-and-coming local politicians, for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, but across the country, because I just told you of one example there in Ohio. There's some other Midwestern mayors, so I'm sure there are a few of them are running to the tall grass now that it's very obvious that their sexual relations with her are in some cases going to be coming out. And you might even wonder why this is the case. Later on, Axios points out that the case, if nothing else, demonstrates China's strategy of cultivating relationships that may take years or even decades to bear fruit. The Chinese Communist Party knows that today's mayors and city council members are tomorrow's governors and members of Congress. And, of course, one of those individuals is Representative Eric Swalwell, who is a Democrat representative from California, serves on the House Intelligence Committee. Tell me how you have an individual who has had intimate relations and long-term relations with a Chinese spy and has access to sensitive intelligence information in the House, that he's still on that committee. But nevertheless, this woman was involved in campaign fundraising, extensive networking, personal charisma, romantic and sexual relationships, and those kinds of things. She was involved with him. She took part in fundraising activities, for example, for his 2014 re-election campaign. He actually was using her in a number of different ways, and she also was able to place, as far as we know, at least one intern in Congressman Swalwell's office. And then eventually the federal investigators became so alarmed about her behavior and activities that they did alert, finally, Representative Eric Swalwell about that. And his office has said, okay, Representative Swalwell long ago provided information about this person whom he met more than 8 years ago and whom he hasn't seen in nearly 6 years. We'll see. To protect information that might be classified, he will not participate in the story. When some reached out and asked if he was sexually involved with them, they said, well, that's classified. So that's as far as we can go with that story today. But this story, as they say in the journalist business, it has legs. We're going to hear a lot more about it in the future. But if that's not enough, here's one more on China. And this one comes from the Republican-led Senate Finance Committee and the Republican-led Homeland Security Committee. Now, it might be tempting for some people to say, well, it's Republicans, so I don't trust them. But again, these have been validated by other people other than those in the Senate, because that's where the investigation comes. But again, very quickly, let me just mention the fact that these two particular committees undertook an investigation into potential conflicts of interest. And at the time, it really began looking primarily at the issue of Ukraine and the position that Hunter Biden has on the board of Burisma, which was in Ukraine. But since then, as it's expanded, it is now looked at what happens in China. And so they concluded that Hunter Biden and Devon Archer engaged in numerous financial transactions with Chinese nationals who have deep connection with the Communist Party in China. These include Xi Jinping and Ganwen Dong. Again, apologize for any of my Asian friends out there if I've mispronounced their names, but these are individuals that executed various transactions with these companies. That would be the China Energy Company, the China Energy Fund Committee, and a number of others, which again have connections to, and let's just face it, almost anything that's official in China has connections to the Chinese Communist Party. So that's the issue. And so they look at this, and then they look at some of the affiliations with the People's Liberation Army. But here's the other troubling piece that's come out, and that is there is very good evidence of connections between Yi Jianming, who is financially connected to the vice president's brother. That would be James Biden. So the connections between the Biden family, that would be Joe Biden, James Biden, Hunter Biden, and Chinese nationals is significant. And the report states that Hunter Biden has extensive connections to Chinese businesses and Chinese foreign nationals that are linked to the communist government. These contacts bore financial fruit when his father was vice president and after he left office. They go on to explain a number of other connections between Hunter Biden, James Biden, Sarah Biden, Devon Archer, and a number of others. But it is a great illustration of why, again, we are going to have to pay attention to China when I suspect that this incoming administration will not pay attention to China. And the way in which the Chinese government has been so effective in co-opting some of these political leaders is, I think, a source of some concern in light of this incredible report that came out from John Ratcliffe, who, of course, is the head of national intelligence. Just before we end, let me at least acknowledge that we have some things happening in terms of the vaccine and the virus, because yesterday there were a number of people in the UK that actually were given a shot of the Pfizer vaccine. The first man to get the shot was William Shakespeare. I love that. And first woman actually was a 90-year-old woman, and so far, so good. But I would point out the one negative that came out, and that is there were 2 people that had an allergic reaction. That's not surprising, but it's something I thought I'd mention because you're going to be hearing people talking about this. Because after all, they oftentimes, if you go to a doctor's office, ask if you have an allergic reaction in the past to medicines, to food, to vaccines, and there were 2 individuals that did. So that's something to pay attention to. But so far, this is what we know about the Pfizer vaccine in the UK. And also, since I didn't really have a chance to get to it, you might want to read a little bit more about COVID and the new age of censorship. Alex Berenson just points out the fact that not only has he had difficulty with Amazon even trying to publish his booklets, but the company they own, that is YouTube, is censored more than 200,000 videos. Facebook has censored some videos and put fact check on them as well. And even the Danish authors of the study on masks had trouble getting a journal article. And although he's got these booklets, has not found a publisher. And so even though Alex Berenson's been on this program, and he's definitely left of center, but very nice man, I've enjoyed interviewing him, said, maybe I'm going to have to reluctantly turn to a conservative publisher if that's what it takes to be true to liberal principles. I might recommend that he get maybe contact with Regnery, because the book that we talked about that did an analysis of some of the pandemic and lockdowns was published by Regnery. And isn't it interesting, Alex Berenson, who's kind of left and center, might actually have to get a book published with a right-wing publisher. Who would have guessed? Anyway, Andrew and Steve, thank you for your help. We are looking forward to a great program tomorrow. We'll see you right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.